Oh.
Really impressive.
Let's,
anyway, so thank you again.
Well, thank you, Victoria. And my name is Luca Muscara. And as Victoria said, I'm based at the University of Rome. And despite some activities in the media arts I did during the 80s, I'm mostly focusing on political geography at the moment, political and urban geography. And I shall pretty soon try to give you a better understanding of my current work. I just wish I can shift this so that okay. That's a little better. Because of connecting the portable to the projector, all the icons are shuffled. So now I need to look for...
It's kind of appropriate for your lecture, huh?
Yeah. Okay, well, first of all, I want to apologize if my English is a little bit rusty, and so you may excuse a few Italianisms during the conversation.
But you use your hands, right?
Yes, that may help. I conceived this talk as a kind of an orbit among a few different concepts. So first of all, I would like to explain what we intend as geography and as political geography. And because of that, you may have a better understanding of what we are working on, especially in terms of networks and iconographies. The reason why geography exists is because the planet, our planet, is not a billiard ball. It's not all the same, but it's all differentiated. And the main differences are not those of physical geography, not those of the landscape, of the ocean, or of the mountain chains or the deserts, but are really those that belong to the human geography, to the distribution patterns of human beings all over our planet. My interest in the field has focused on the theory of a French geographer named Jean Gottman, who was alive between 1915 and 1994, and who became famous for theorizing megalopolis. That is the idea that all the cities on the northeastern seaboard of the United States were working as a unique region, as a unique network of cities. And he saw that back in the 50s, way before we started to talk about global city regions, which is a common concept today. But his main contribution deals with the fact that he had been trained in France and was forced to escape to the States during World War II because of his Jewish origin. And because of this situation, he found himself matching the French methodology and the American methodology. In the French School of Geography, to explain the differences of human cohabitation patterns on the planet, traditionally it was used the concept of circulation, movement. So in order to understand where the cities were going to be built, where the major roads were being tracked, and where most of the human activity was happening, they were talking about, and they were interested in these flows of circulation. And the flows of circulation actually preceded the birth of the cities and the regionalization of space, the divisioning, the partitioning of space in different political regions. But before we get to the birth of the city, Gottman started to dig a little bit more on the origin of the roads. And I have translated a short piece from French, which has not been published in English yet. And it's a very beautiful piece that he wrote in 1952 on the origins of the road. And I would like to share it with you. Hopefully my translation shall be understandable.
Is John Gottman a famous name in geography?
Yes. He's considered one of the seminal thinkers, especially because of Megalopolis. But his political geography is not so well known. And especially because, as we shall see, he tried to explain all the different partitioning of political space in terms of interplay between circulation and what he called iconographies. And we're going to see what he means with that. But before getting there, I wish to read some short excerpts from his 1952 book. He writes, for a long time we have tried to understand the origins of the roads. Most specialists in general agree that primitive humans, fearing to be prosecutioned, hunted like an animal, tried to erase their own tracks. When they found themselves in unknown territories, they tended to follow defined itineraries. The animal trails were first adopted as roads. This explanation also explains one of the most ancient fears, the fear of the crossroad. That is part of many different folklores. The humans would know of which animal they were following the trail, but when this trail crossed with another, it was not possible to know who or what one was going to face. A threatening wild animal or another human filled with bad instincts, the crossroads have inspired many fears and many legends, and something is left at the bottom of man's heart. When arriving at the crossroad, one always wished to be protected. The primitives were worshipping the trees they'd found, adobing them with different amulets. Later, these crossroads were marked with stones, white or black ones, according to the iconographies. The Kaaba at the Mecca, great center of pilgrimage that before the Hegira was a great caravan city, is a big black stone. For a long time we shall find the game of white and black stones in the architecture. Of the different basilicas. Only much later, such stones at the crossroads became boundary indicators, so that the ancient traveler would know from the color of the stones if he'd arrived in a friendly or hostile country, according to its iconography. Religions always multiplied the monuments, the expression of compassion at the crossroad, calvaries and chapels, marabout and basilicas, all kinds of sanctuaries for all kinds of creeds. Such was thought to be a sufficient protection until it was possible to establish an early road patrolling. With the progress in social organization, the different powers, military, civilian, or clerical, took control of the protection of trade and of circulation in the most effective way, with a police force that was naturally established at the crossroad and was imposing to travelers a tax to pay for the security it was guaranteeing. In the shade of this I don't know how to translate, a roccaforte is like a castle upon a hill, like a middle-aged castle, or of a cathedral, the marketplaces were established and prospered. So that's a key theme in Gottman. First comes the circulation, first comes the road. Because of the complexity brought up by the crossroad, comes the religious factor, the need of worshipping an object, a tree, a stone, as a way of signaling to other humans and also of guaranteeing, protection from the sky, from above. So at the crossroad, we really find the original founding element of the city. That is a symbolic religious element. And where the temple is established, next to the temple, there's always a marketplace. And so that's the second element of the city. Okay, so marketplaces were established. They provided to the local authorities and population considerable incomes. Such mechanisms transformed the good position of the crossroads in investments for the local people who should maintain its rayoning and its richness, the orbit of the Carrefour on the surrounding territory. Thus, the deriving incomes allowed to improve the police, to extend the security system and the state, and it was possible to build the state. At the crossroad we found the reunion of circulation, iconography, and the police, the latter one symbolizing the political organization and in our days the state. This triple association was fruitful. It allows to explain the differentiation of space and of its organization. It allows to understand that the partitioning of the world depends more on the barriers of the spirit, of the human mind, than on the radiating orbits of the crossroads, and on the radiating orbits of the crossroads, than on any physical feature inscribed in the physical landscape. Okay, so this was the excerpt. So we see that circulation traditionally in geography was a key element to read the space, to read the human territory. The new element that Gottman introduces is this concept of iconography. In this excerpt, it was related to symbolic and religious meanings, But of course, an iconography is much wider than that, and it may include not only religious, but also political, social, historical elements that are related to the community. When we talk about circulation, we talk about movement of ideas, movement of people, movement of information, movement of merchandise, movement of armies, movement of money, of course. That's what we mean with the circulation flows. But when we talk about iconographies, not exactly in the sense of art history, we mean more specifically an abstract set of symbols that relates a community to a given territory. We know that human communities are able to live and prosper in many different physical environments, from hot to cold, from dry to humid, many different elevations. The physical range of environments we are able to adapt is quite wide on this planet. So the problem is not really the physical environment, it's the human environment. The Earth, of course, is big enough to carry probably 5, 6, or 10 times the population we have today. So the problem is not really a limited amount of resources or a limited amount of space available to the human population. The problem is the distribution of resources and the fact that all the population wants to gather in the same places.
LA.
For example. Well, LA is a wonderful example, a city that 50 years ago was a very, very tiny little place. And in 50 years, got a population of 12 or 15 million people, and which doesn't mean that it has learned how to be a city yet, but which takes a little while. It's not sufficient to have the technical infrastructures. You don't need it's not only a matter of buildings or of freeways, you know, to make a city. You have to develop a spirit of cohabitation, of sharing a life in the same place. And especially when there are different cultures coming from different parts of the world, then the need to share these diversities into the very same place, you know, becomes more of a challenge. So it's really, that's why the word that we use, politics, when we talk about political geography, we talk about politics, come from the ancient Greek polis, which means the city. So the politics comes from the city, from living in the same space and from sharing the same space and finding a way of positive way of cohabitation. So the important thing about iconographies, according to Gottman, is that they work as a factor of resistance to the excess of change brought by the circulation flows. I shall explain this more extensively. Plato, in the ancient Greece, thought that the ideal settlement, which was supposed to be a city-state, in order to gain internal stability, was supposed to have a limited population. Its population couldn't grow, without end. At a certain point, they needed to stop in order to guarantee the stability in the settlement. So the key of the cohabitation, according to Plato, was the search for stability. So not only the population, if the city population would grow too much, a part of the population should migrate and found another city, a new city, but also to be protected from change, the city should be located at quite a distance from the sea. Because in the old days, the sea was the internet of today. The sea was the origin of change. It was where change was coming from. So in order to be safe and maintain a certain stability, according to Plato, it was necessary to maintain a certain demographic threshold and to maintain a certain distance from the sea. Of course, this is a theory, and not always it had been possible to realize this Platonic concept. Rather the contrary, the opposite. Aristotle, following Plato, reversed these ideas and rather posed the basis for the contemporary concept of networking. His best pupil, who was to become Alexander the Great, actually decided that all his city that he was going to found and that became the living engines of his great empire were to be founded by the sea and at the mouth of a major river, in order to ensure better circulation towards the interior of the territory and also towards the outside. That's why all his Alexandrias, most of them are to be found, like Alexandria of Egypt, are found exactly, is found exactly at the mouth of the Nile on the Mediterranean. So basically that was an opposite concept compared to Plato, to the ideal city, closed space of the city of Plato. It was an idea of different cities interconnected one with the other, using the available technology of the time, that is the water. Gottman, who had a very good knowledge of the ancient thinkers, like Plato and Aristotle, modeled the ancient thought with the contemporary thought in geography, in such a way that he said communities throughout space and time open or close their living space, the borders of their cities or of their region, according to an oscillating prevailing need for opportunities or for security. So when a community feels safe enough to be able to master not only its own territory, but go beyond that and travel outside its own territory, searching for new resources, new opportunities, we will see the space opening up. And the circulation flow will start to prevail. When a community, on the other side, is threatened by some kind of menace, the natural reaction would be to close the space in search for security. Well, according to Gottman, iconography is part of this search for security. So we build our images, and not only abstract images, but images that relate us to our community and to our land, to our territories, in order to stop the excess of change coming from circulation flows. Because, of course, when we are talking about circulation flows, there's always a community who is the subject of this circulation and who is pushing for these flows to fill the space, and other communities who maybe are the object and the victim sometimes of this circulation and of this search of opportunities of the first community, and who may feel threatened in their own identity, in the very same survival of their own group. So what happens is that, according to Gottman, the community who feels threatened by an external menace will try to enforce its own iconography. This concept, I found this concept quite useful in order to explain the current political, geopolitical situation at a global scale, which, as Victoria said before, is a very scary situation, especially at the present time. But before we try to apply to the contemporary context this circulation iconography model, I want to show you one slide that shall help to enforce this idea of circulation and as a major engine of the Western civilization. This image is not a very high-tech, it's a very low-tech map, but I think it will prove useful and comes from the work of an Italian geneticist, Cavalli Sforza, who's been at Stanford University for a few decades. He's not a geographer, he's a geneticist, but has been reconstructing, based on genetic sampling, the map of occupation of the Earth continents by the human population of our very same species, the sapiens sapiens. Yeah, I think so. Sorry, but all my documents icons got messed up.
We get to see your portrait a little bit.
Yeah. Maybe I have a a smaller version here. Okay, well, okay, this is the tree that shows the genetic distance matched with the linguistic distance, the linguistic drift among all the major groups in human population of our same species. But basically, according to Cavalli Sforza, genetically there is no big difference. Even the most distant groups, like the Pygmies in Africa and the Aboriginals in Australia or in New Zealand, are not genetically different. Their language is the most distant, but in terms of linguistic drift. But and what changes are, of course, the external features which are related to climatic adaptation. But genetically, there is no difference, and actually, he suggests that we should even abolish the use of the word race. Okay. Cavalli Sforza and his partners at Stanford University worked for over 30 years in sampling the first 8 genes in the ADN sequence of samples of all ethnic groups on the Earth. It took them about 30 years to do this job, and basically they reconstructed this map, which was also matched with the results of the archaeologists and with the results of the linguistic studies. Basically, our species is supposed to have appeared in Africa, and even if it's not clear if it appeared in this central eastern part of Africa or more in southern Africa, that's very unclear, but it was Africa for sure. And then he tracked the major migrations. Every migration corresponds to a bifurcation that can be tracked in the genetic sequence and also in the language. So, of course, major bifurcation was the one that brought from this area that we call the Horn of Africa to the so-called fertile half-moon. That is the area between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Mesopotamia. That's the area where the first cities developed, where agriculture developed about 1,000 years ago, and where human communities passed from a nomadic way of living to a sedentary way of living. Of course, there were other bifurcations. The arrows are really very approximative, but just to give you an idea of the targets of each arrow, and also, of course, the possibility of having precise dates for such bifurcation is extremely reduced. But what is interesting to me is to see that basically there was one bifurcation that from the fertile half-moon brought a group to move westward towards Europe and a group to move eastward. We don't know exactly if this group that moved eastward was the same became from the same bifurcation or from a different bifurcation, more closer to the Indian Ocean, because we should remember that here we got the Himalaya mountains, which used to be kind of an obstacle to the circulation flow. So basically, one group was moving towards the Indian subcontinent below the Himalaya, and another group was moving towards the big China plains above the Himalaya. And of course, I won't explain in details all the different bifurcations, but what is interesting to know is that this very same group, through the Bering Strait, according to a theory of a small ice age on the Bering Strait, was able to cross over from Kamchatka to Alaska and descend on the Americas. So this was just an idea to see how much circulation is at the origin, at the very same origin of a human being, and also to think about the unity of the human species. A unity that became challenged quite a few times in history, and a particular image of this challenge, of this gap, is the one that takes place when the Spanish conquistadors cross the Atlantic and meet the Aztec civilization. This passage is beautifully underlined in a short dialogue, a short literary piece written by an Italian writer, Italo Calvino, who imagined to have a dialogue with Montezuma regarding his encounter with Hernán Cortés, the head of the conquistadores. In this dialogue, Montezuma says a few things, and I have excerpted those that were more interesting, and I have translated them as well in English. Think of how many things came up to me that didn't have a name, and of which I continuously had to make sense of. Above the ocean, floating houses appeared with textile wings filled with wind. Montezuma, according to Calvino, could not recognize the Spaniards as human beings, as belonging to the same species, but he thought them being of a divine nature. Maybe it would have been possible, this is Montezuma again, I thought it was, a new age, where the qualities of the invaders, that I believe divine, would have merged with our civilization, much more ordered and refined. But beyond this imagination, there is still this gap that remains between Montezuma and Cortés. And this sentence, I believe, is quite important even for the actual situation. To fight an enemy, one would need to move in its very same space. One must exist in its very same time. But we were looking at each other from different dimensions without even touching each other. If I could think the Spaniards, let them enter in the order of my thoughts. Be sure about their real essence, gods or evil demons, it doesn't matter, or beings like us, subject to divine or evil will. Basically, if I could make of them from unconceivable creatures something upon which my thought could stop and grasp it, then, only then, I could have made them my allies or my enemies. I could have recognized them as my prosecutors or victims. For him, for Cortés, it was like for me. The real victory would have been that of being able to think me, of thinking me. His reason could not envelop in his net my own reason. And you too, you superimpose your gods to the facts. So it's, I found very fascinating and scary at the same time the idea that human beings of different communities but of the same species that had just followed throughout thousands of years different paths and different bifurcations, when finally they meet again in Central America, they are not able to recognize each other as part of the same original community. They do not share a language, and they have different technological abilities, and they cannot think of the other. Montezuma as human. Montezuma thinks of the Spaniards as a divine presence, sent by gods or a divine nature. And Cortés, who of course was in a foreign territory and with a very limited number of soldiers, studied very carefully the situation before moving, but once he got a grasp on what the situation was, basically he made Montezuma attacked by his very same population. Montezuma was not fighting the Spaniards because he thought they were divine. And once the Spaniards started to become a real threat, the people of Montezuma, in fear, because Montezuma was not reacting, they imprisoned him. And that was the beginning of the end. So, what is interesting is seeing how much Western culture, Western civilization, from the basin of the Mediterranean, where the very same sedentarization process began, when the city was born, throughout the century, in this maybe metaphysical search of opportunities, started to circulate all over the planet to reach other groups. And I really believe that we should consider this symbolic moment when Montezuma and Cortés meet as the origin of the so-called globalization process. Of course, today, when we discuss economic globalization, we are thinking about something very specific, the idea that within the same added value production chain, you would have financiers located in New York City or in Switzerland. You would have production plants located in Southeast Asia, and maybe you would producing goods that are sold on the markets of Latin America or Europe. And so the idea is that the same process, production, economic process, takes place within different parts of the world, and they are all interconnected. But of course, it started way beyond, and and we could even say that this idea of circulation and of networking is part of the very same iconography of the West. We have this push towards the outside of our own space, which has characterized especially this tradition. And now it's merging with many other different traditions. And as we all know, just to say a very, very simple thing, in the West, with the Greek philosophy, and in the West in general, time was always conceived as an arrow, while in the East, traditionally, time is conceived as a circle. So each community has a certain degree of change that it can take. And of course, this would change according to the place and according to time. And but the West has shown to have such a strong impetus towards the outside, towards transcending its own boundaries, more than other communities. And I'm trying not to make any cultural judgment in this. I'm just trying to recognize what we know has happened, at least throughout history. Today, we find ourselves with a globalized planet, enveloped by fiber optic networks and submarine and ocean cables that link one continent to the other, while orbiting a constellation of satellites also encircle the Earth, keeping together human networks that were formed throughout history when the technological tools were much different, when basically the relation between places, especially in different continents, was kept only thanks to the art of navigation. And suddenly we, not only we have these multiple networks connecting all our cities, but especially since World War II, we have enforced in the West an iconography of circulation, of which globalization is a part of. And this Prometheic spirit, the spirit of Prometheus, this mythical character that stole the fire from the gods, which is such a strong part of Western iconography, and now takes the shape of fiber optics or satellite connections. I suppose that one of the main issues would be a matter of speed. Of speed. Meaning that even in its most, in its best instincts, the West has thought about a reunion of the human species, no matter from where. The ability of every different group to share the same world and to basically to cohabit on the same planet peacefully. And this is strongly part of our contemporary iconography. And of course, this is enforced through our technologies, through our production systems, through the networks, the very same networks that we build on one side. But of course, there's also a structural, infrastructural part of this that's related to how the entire machine works, not only in the West, of course. I'm talking about the energy issues and the military issues. This would open up an enormous area of thought. But looking at the present situation, we see how so much of these elements are there. At the moment, I'm more interested in looking at the cultural aspects. So when the Western civilization came in touch with other civilizations, non-Western, we have seen a certain degree of exchange and integration on one side and on the other. Of course, the example of Cortés and Montezuma is one of the most violent and symbolically striking. But of course, there could be, hopefully, a more peaceful kind of merging. But the fact that the two civilizations, the two cultures, do integrate one with the other is not to be taken for granted. If the incoming civilization, in this case the West, meets another community, another civilization, with an excess of violence, with an excess, introducing an excess of change, to the point that this community would feel threatened in its own survival, then, according to Gottman, there will be a classic reaction. The classic reaction would be a reaction of closure of space, and enforcement of iconographies, because these iconographies, as we said, are those abstract set of symbols that root the community to its own territory. So when a community is in fear, it will dig and search for its own roots, which are symbolic roots. Can we apply this model to an explanation of Islamic fundamentalism? I strongly believe so. As we have seen, religious elements are a powerful part of a community iconography. And even if the Islamic world has always been historically at a geographic interface between the East and the West, having a very powerful tradition in trade, and basically being able to manage the gap between other cultures, so they were actually the mediators. Once that the entire axis of circulation shifted across the Atlantic, so the old axis of circulation with the Middle East and between the Mediterranean and Asia became less important, of course they lost their importance, and not only the Arab culture lost that importance, but all the Mediterranean people, of course, who didn't have a direct access to the Atlantic, found themselves in an unfavorable position. But this was to speak of the old days. What is happening today and what has happened throughout the 20th century seems to have challenged, especially in the past 2 or 3 decades, the identity of many communities in that part of the world. And such communities felt so threatened that in order to re-establish their own identity, they have to call up for their own roots, or for an interpretation of what their ancient roots and their ancient religious textbooks were. Because according to other Islamologists, the current interpretation of the fundamentalism is not the only interpretation of Islam that is possible. So this fundamentalism is one possible interpretation of Islam that tries to enforce the identity of that group in opposition to the identity of all the other groups. We come to the current situation. Of course, all these cultural conflicts have to be positioned within a wider picture that takes into account the geopolitical map of the world, which is an icon in itself, and of course the balance of powers, not only political but also economic and military powers. Locally, we know that after World War II, the world had a certain kind of balance for some 45 years, a period that we used to call the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, in the 80s decade, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, which was part of one of the ancient roads of humanity on this planet, one of the ancient circulation corridors. The United States, because of the global balance of powers, decided to sustain, as it had happened many other times before, to sustain a local guerrilla to fight against the Soviet army. Afghan guerrilla of Afghan warriors that became, seen from an Arab point of view, became a very idealistic thing to do in the 80s. And from many different parts of the Arab world, the youngsters were leaving their countries to go and fight the Soviet in Afghanistan. They were like freedom fighters. And the whole thing was supported by the United States through the intelligence, through supply of weapons, in many different, and of training, of course, in many different ways. When the Soviets collapsed, and I won't enter here into the issue of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but and of its relation to the Afghan war. But basically, what happened was that the guys who fought the war over there, not only they thought that they had conquered back their own territory, but they thought they had defeated the Soviet Union. And on the other side, at that point, because of the shift in the general balance of powers, the United States thought that it was not so important to sustain locally those warriors anymore, once that the Soviets had left. So those guys were practically abandoned to their destiny. And being practically war veterans of another war, but still veterans, with all the trauma implied by having fought within a war for a decade, and a war that completely devastated the country, which was brought back to a level of development much lower than the one it had reached until the mid-70s. In the mid-70s, Afghanistan and Kabul was still a very important and flourishing city, relatively, but and in the early 90s, Afghanistan was like no man's land. So this helps to understand maybe how comes that such war veterans started to join the Taliban movement that came out of the Pakistani madrasas, this basically very low religious school. I mean, low in terms of age, because they entered the madrasa from the age of 5 or 6, I believe. And so there was a linking of the element of religion with the element of fight. Not only symbolically, but also physically in terms of the people. And going back to the ancient icon of the Saladin, which is the icon of the warrior in the Islamic culture, which became part of a renewed mythology. Of course, the fact that we are able to explain with this in terms of reinforcement of a community iconography, the path that brought those guys, if it is true, to the terrorist attacks of September 11, doesn't mean at all that we intend to justify such attacks. The point is that we condemn such attacks, of course, but we need to understand not only the symptoms, but we need to understand the causes. That's the main point. So when there were already many signals, especially dealing with icons, happening during the 90s. Since the Taliban had established their power in Afghanistan, I think it's quite well known that they banned most of Western items, including cinema, radio, and interestingly, also the image of the woman was banned. And this is, for me, it's interesting, compared to the iconography of the West, where the image of the woman is used to sell anything. And I can't escape but to look at this paradoxical opposition. But the most clear symbol was in the spring of 2001 when they bombed the Buddhas of Banyan, very ancient, huge sculptures that are part not only of the Buddhist religion, but are part of the world cultural heritage and so belong to everybody. And it was hard to understand why those guys were bombing, these monuments. My explanation is that in order to re-establish in a wicked way, their own iconography, they had to destroy other communities' iconographies, beginning with their neighbors on the east side, and that is with the symbols of Buddhism. But it's evident that the attacks of September 11 brought their challenge to another scale. Not only in short-circuiting two main icons of the West, like the jetliner and the skyscraper. Really a macabre dance. But in making use of our very same circulation networks to destroy our icons. That was the paradox. The reaction to September 11. It goes by the book, according to Gottman. Immediate reaction is a complete block of the circulation in the West. All the airports are closed. New York City is closed. The stock exchange is closed for 1 week. It never happened before. This is reaction number one, block of the circulation. Reaction number two is enforcement of iconography. Our identity this time felt threatened. So we need to know who we are. We need to cover under the same flag. And especially, and this is the key point, we need to face the fact that after globalization, the enemy is not outside of our world, somewhere else, but is within our very same cities. It's inconceivable that someone takes a jet and uses it to destroy himself, all the passengers, and a building filled with thousands of people. Nobody would have thought so in the West. But we cannot really face the idea that our enemy, the enemy of our civilization, is within our same civilization. We need to think, for identitary reason and for security, but psychological security reasons, that the enemy is always somewhere else. We cannot face the idea that the enemy is within our cities, is within our networks, is within our bodies. We cannot face that. So we have, despite the fact that today, as these terrorist attacks have proven, there is no more, not just a war between states, as it used to be in the old days, the classic convention of war of one state against the other, and each state knew where the borders were, and there was an entire war protocol. This is all gone. The enemy is not a state. We have to think that it's within a state because it's easier. It's reassuring. It makes feel everybody safer. To think that the enemy is yesterday Afghanistan of the Taliban, tomorrow North Korea or Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or Sudan. We need to identify the enemy and put him within very well established borders. The problem is that it's not like this. It would be too easy if it was like this. As we have seen, the terrorists who took down the towers and hit the Pentagon, some of them have been living in our city in the States for years, completely integrated. We call them sleepers. We have to face that. And this is why we have to look not only at the symptoms, but at the causes of this terrorist phenomenon. And this is why I believe that, as Calvino said, in order to fight the enemy, we need to be able to live in its very same time and in its very same space. Well, okay, I think we got enough elements on the table.
This was really a fascinating lecture and it brought up all kinds of ideas in my head. Do you mind if everybody takes a break and then we ask you some questions?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good to me.
Why don't we take a 10-15-minute break and then when we come back we can discuss some. Excellent.
Thank you.
Did you see that?
Yeah.
Was that amazing or what?
Well, it was amazing because just the information he was giving as an international rep representing human justice.
Exactly. I mean, to me, it was just like, thank you. You know, there's peoples like that, and there's hope. And for those of you who didn't see it, Adam Shapiro, he's obviously of Jewish origin, and yet he's international, part of an international peace group, and he managed to get into the Arafat complex and actually speak to Arafat. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, the power of kind of human spirit and truth, because people obviously believe his sincerity, you know, and believing that sincerity, he got to the actual source of what's going on. And for those of you who saw it, you also probably noticed that his tongue got cut off. And you know, I saw the first version where, you know, his mouth was still opening and they just took out the sound. And it was just really devastating that I couldn't hear more of what he experienced, what he thought, you know, and I just thought that we got a glimpse of a higher being, you know, that was talking about a very different approach and kind of a future possibility, because they asked him that, they said in New York, he's considered a traitor by the Jewish community, and how does he feel about that? And he said, I'm not a traitor, I'm a human being. And I just thought, I love this man, you know, I just thought there's hope in this world. And then they went back to a barrage of crap, you know, and I just turned it off. So with that, why don't we open it up to some questions or discussion that anybody has. And I'm going to pass the mic so that we can save it for later. Did you have something?
Yeah, well, I guess in the end of your talk, you were talking about resurgence of iconography, and you began to talk in a we can't face the enemy that could be within our boundaries, our bodies, our networks. One thing I'm interested in is your use of the we in that statement, and I'm wondering how you think it relates as far as national boundaries, as far as national iconography, how you think it relates to people outside of the United States in dealing with what happened. Is the we the West? Is the we the United States? What's this we that has this resurgence?
It's a very good question. On September 11, I was in Europe myself, and in Paris in particular. And so, and of course, I was informed quite soon of the attacks, and it was very easy for me to see the reaction on the European side to these attacks. And basically, I was in France, but also I had many phone calls that afternoon from Italy, and I spoke to a few friends in New York, and I realized that Europe was possibly even more shocked than the United States right away, since during the Cold War, Western Europe grew up protected by the United States, militarily speaking. And the fact that the Pentagon had been attacked and the towers had been destroyed looked like there was no protection anymore. And while at least in the United States there was an immediate almost immediate response, and so the country was still there, and there was I think that Europe felt really weak at that point because it relies so much, militarily speaking, on the power of the United States. Of course, when I use the first plural person and say we have to face the fact that the enemy is within our cities, within our network, I'm not speaking in terms of a specific national group, but I'm more speaking in terms of an ideal community of people that is located, doesn't matter where. That's the community I identify myself with, beyond the fact that I was born or I carry an Italian passport. And of course, I am part of the Western culture myself, because I grew up in it, and that's the culture I know. This is the real issue. And the paradox we are facing. On one side, we were just discussing this during the break with Victoria. On one side, this trend of globalization has put in touch very different people from very different traditions, from very different communities. And I want to enter into the merit of the quality of this connection, if it's good or bad, if it has been violent or peaceful. That's not the point here. But the point is that we have this connectivity, global connectivity. And the complexity of the human geography, of the fact that we now have like 6 billion people on Earth, which is a number that is quite unthinkable. If we take just an abstract time span, we think about a lifetime of 100 years. There are not 6 billion seconds in 100 years. Okay, so we don't even have a second for each inhabitant of the Earth. To face this complexity, and also to make reason of all the different historical and geographical differentiation of each community, we have invented in Europe this concept of the state-nation, which was a very practical way to define the identities and the border. The globalization has gone beyond, way beyond the state nations. so that we have really interconnected networks of cities, of added value chains of productions, global diasporas and migration flows, all mixing in our cities, basically, which are the nodes of this human network. Now that the West is scared because of the terrorist attacks, it is trying to bring back history of 500 years. Okay, say, okay, we have been joking, you know, there is no globalization, each one has its own national territory with very defined boundaries. We are here, and who is with us is our ally, and who is not with us is our enemy. And that's very black and white way of looking at the world, and we all know that the world is never so black and white. There's 1,000 of probably a million of gray tones in the scale between the white and the black. But of course, in order to think of this complexity, we have to simplify it. And the way they have chosen to simplify this is to bring the war on terrorism back to the concept of the state-nation. So the enemy has to be in a state-nation. And I'm not saying that there may even be that some state nations are or have in the past really supported some terrorism. But this is not the point. The point is that this terrorism is really a global phenomenon, because it's not located only in one country. It spans many different countries, and not only in the Arab world, but in the Western world and in other parts of the world. So that's the issue we have to face, and it's a very hard issue to manage, because if on one side, because of the economic globalization, we need to open up the boundaries, on the other side now, we need to close the boundaries to protect ourselves. That's the paradox we are facing. So I hope this answers to your question.
Yes, it does, but it also brings up more, of course. So you said something about an ideal community outside of national boundaries.
Yes.
Could you talk more about that, and what sort of iconography do you imagine defining that?
That's an even better question. At the beginning of this year, Europe has introduced a common currency, the euro. After a process of many years of preparation, basically during the 90s, first there was the abolishment of internal barriers between the member states of the European Union. So now if you are Italian, you don't need a passport to go to France, you just go with your driving license and nobody would check it. And now you don't even need to change currency. And of course the currency is a big part of the iconography. One of the issues that is coming up now with this unification of Europe, of Western Europe at least, has to deal with history book, because each European state in its own national tradition had written history books for the school emphasizing the national aspects of their history. And since we all know that throughout history all the European states came into conflict one with the other in many different ways, now we would need it's not easy to rewrite the history books from a common European standpoint. So my personal position is that I try to recognize myself with the best works of every human community, doesn't matter where. If I found some ideas, if I found some intelligence, if I find some beauty, that's what I really recognize myself into. And this, it doesn't matter from which continent it's coming. or from which community it's coming. My point of view is that I know that every community has bad and good sides. And of course, to simplify, we generalize. So on one day we need to have an enemy, so the Soviet Union is the enemy for the United States. Another day the enemy becomes the Taliban. You know, we need to simplify reality. And also we know that human communities are made of people, and people change not only according to the different generations, but according even to within the same day. You know, maybe in the morning you're happy and in the afternoon you are depressed, you know. So when we simplify and say an entire country, you know, they are the enemy, they are bad, they are the evil, it's a very gross simplification. Because we all know that human beings change according to what happens in each community. So I think that the community of spirits that I would like to recognize myself in is, I think, a community of thinkers, a community of intellectuals, a community of artists, of people who have tried to express some ideas, some beauty. Doesn't matter from where. Or maybe it can matter because from the specific context you could have extra information that helps you to understand it better. But not because I want the national boundary to become a limit. Actually, I feel that this community of spirit, that especially in the art world and I think in the intellectual world, could quite well be tracked throughout the 20th century. But of course, it's a much older phenomenon. Is the one I would like to identify myself with. Nationalism is a simplifying key to the complexity of the world. And it has worked to some extent, but not for everybody. And it's not a case that one of the worst conflicts we had throughout the 20th century, and we've still had it, we've been having it for over 55 years, is a conflict between Israeli and Palestinians, which are two traditionally nomadic populations who are fighting for their own, each one for their own state nation. So the idea of the state nation could work very well for sedentary people when each one has its own piece of land. But if two different people share the same piece of land and each one wants its own state nation, you don't get out of it. We haven't found a way yet. So that's probably one of the limits to the same state nation idea. The other limit, a classic limit, very well expressed throughout the 90s in economic, political, and geographic literature is the limit of globalization. So we say the economic globalization goes beyond the state borders. The multinational corporation sometimes have a budget which is bigger than that of a small state. I think that the issue is also an issue of, it's a key political issue, and deals with our political institutions. Our systems are classified among representative democracies, meaning that the people votes a representative these representatives are elected and are supposed to run the country on the behalf of the people. It seems that this mechanism, who may have been possibly good in another epoch when the communities were more restricted and even the numbers were much smaller, is not working quite well as it was today. In my knowledge, a lot of people in Western countries on both sides of the Atlantic do not feel really very well represented by their own governments. But the problem is that nobody has invented yet another political way of running the cohabitation, because we need a way to run the cohabitation of different groups. Of course, we would hope that this political institution would be an expression of the community itself. And maybe we still subscribe to the values of the Declaration of Independence of the United States, or to the values expressed by the French Revolution. But it gets harder to recognize yourself in the actual faces of the people who are representing you, in their actions, and in the bureaucracies that has been collateral result of the political institution of the state. Do we really need bureaucracies? We have probably to make a better use of our imagination, and maybe the networks could be a great help in this direction, to foresee maybe a different political system, a different way of ruling our own communities. But the key issue is, where do we put the borders? Where do we draw the borders? Because in a globalized world, the borders are the world itself. Jean Gottman used to say that the physical barriers, the mountain chains, the deserts, the oceans, have never been a real border for human beings, who have proved many times to be able to overcome such physical borders. He also said that the harshest borders to overcome are those in the mind of the people. And one of the reasons why I really like this French geographer is that his view of the world, his view of the territory, is what he called a psychosomatic territory. You know, psychosomatic usually is employed in medicine to represent a specific type of diseases which affect the body but are actually a consequence of some psychological trouble. In this case, the soma of the body of psychosomatic would be the entire planet. So we read the planet as a manifestation of the disease of the psychic disease of human communities. And that's why we see the borders opening or closing. And that's why it's interesting to look at the Earth on its whole as a way, as if it was a book written throughout the generation and by the different communities, by the human species.
I just wanted to extend that the notion of the simplified politics, of the government as a simplified form of human representation, to the iconography as a simplified form of cultural representation.
Yes.
And how, I mean, you talked about the iconography being generated as a result of the insecurity of the community, right?
Yes.
With globalization, I feel that the icon itself, I mean, there's a question of, does the culture really own its own icons? I mean, does corporate culture has appropriated icons which are cultural, right? And so we don't trust the iconography anymore. The iconography and culture are not anymore, to me, truly linked in a closed way, because I mean, often the icon, for example, in a corporate iconography is more representative of the market than of of the corporation. You know, so it's not, you're not representing yourself. You are representing
a projection.
Yeah, a projection, and you're actually representing the people whom you want to identify with, or whom you, I mean, the people whom you would like to identify with you. So it is often not a true projection of your own cultural identity, right?
I agree with you, and actually you allow me to underline a point which I hadn't made explicit before, that deals with the fact that iconographies, and especially national iconographies, have been used by governments in order to rule the people. And I think we can find 1,000 examples in history. But as soon as the state nations were established, you know, it doesn't matter which are the contents of the iconography. What it matters is how it works to bind a community to a land. Of course, we could see that the political map of the country is an icon. The flag is another icon. The national currency is an icon. But even the national anthem, which is not an image, is also part of the iconography. And there could be even more abstract, non-visual set of values which are part of the iconography. So, for example, we in the West recognize ourselves in the values expressed in the Declaration of Independence, or in the French Revolution, or in other major statements in political history. The thing is that there is a gap between the individual identity and the group identity. Sometimes the individual needs to match his own identity with the identity of the group he lives in. But psychologically speaking, the two identities are separate, because something is the individual taken by himself, and something is the individual within its own group, within its own community. So I suppose that this type of national iconographies deal more with not with the single individual taken by himself, but with the individual taken as part of a shared community, a community that shares at least the same space. Now, with the networks, what we find is that you may find yourself to share more ideas or more values with somebody else who is living in another continent than maybe with your neighbor that is living on in the next building, or on the floor below or above you in your apartment flat. But of course, because of the way we work as human beings, we have these extensions of our body, these networks that allow us to get almost immediately in touch across the oceans with other people in other cities, in other communities, but still we are local. Our body is localized specifically somewhere. So this is one of our contradictions, which we haven't, I think, solved yet, admitting that it's possible to solve it. The contradiction between the fact that you are always placed locally somewhere, but the people you relate with are not only the people who are locally around you, but are people who are locally somewhere else. And now you can relate to them because of the extensions of your body, of the networks. This is also interesting from the point of view of time zones. And of course, we say that the economic globalization works 24 hours around the clock. Because when the when the Tokyo stock market closes, then the New York stock market opens, and so there is basically continuity almost around the clock. But at the same time, we know that if after 24 hours or 36 hours we don't go to sleep as human beings, we will die very soon, because sleep is necessary part of our life. So we are creating abstract networks, abstract machines, in the McLuhan sense of machines and medium, that are beyond the single human organism. And that this is one of the contradictions we have to deal with. Of course, maybe, I think that a key issue is, and this is one of the reasons why I strongly subscribe to Victoria's position, and even to the same title of this course on networks and consciousness. One of the key issues is exactly to be able to keep these links among a community of people who spread out and scattered all over the geography of the planet, throughout the use of the technology, but of course being the technology only the tool, and being, as a first thing, a sharing of ideas, a sharing of feelings, a sharing of understanding. And because of this sharing of ideas, this sharing of understanding, and because of the fact that we now have the tools, so we don't have to wait for a ship to cross the ocean and come back and tells us here what's happened in Europe or the other way. Now we have the tools, to bring the things together. And maybe this could have some political meaning, even if it's kind of early to know about that. But I believe that if the people who, across the different places, share a common view of the world and a common view of the human being and of life and of the environment maybe and of beauty, and are able to come together across the network, maybe a different political institution could be envisioned because of that. And that political institution, in my opinion, may be able to go beyond the national borders, but in a different way from the concept of the United Nations that we have, which is basically a parliament of the state nations, and not a community in itself. I mean, it becomes a community of diplomatics, but it was not a community that has expressed its own will and desire to rule the cohabitation process, as it could happen from the bottom. To make it happen from the bottom, I believe technological networks could be very important. On the other side, we know that everything that happens in terms of technologies relies heavily on the entire infrastructure, meaning that if there was no global energy system, there would be no networks. It's not only a matter of satellites and wires, it's a matter of keeping the lights on. If we switch off the lights, we know that all our world suddenly disappears. And this was one of the striking things on the very same day of September 11 that maybe many of you have experienced yourselves, by trying to connect to news websites right after, that's what happened to me. I tried to connect to CNN website, to CBS News, to the New York Times website, and they were all jammed, and it was not possible to have access. And then we were laughing about the fact that some politician talked about the threat of hackers and computer pirates to the security of our networks, while the very same circulation flows of people were jamming the entire system, you know. And not only the internet system, but even the telephone networks were jammed on that day. And of course, because our networks are designed for regular use, but if it happens that the entire world is calling New York at the same time, you know, it's not designed to support that kind of thing. So maybe we have to redesign even the networks in giving them a larger buffer.
Can you talk about the limitations of this idea of community of people through the networks in relation to language? In other words, if I have another person in China that's a like-minded soul and interested in similar things like me, there's a huge gap in our communication, or even the possibility for me to connect, for that matter, to understand the work. Recently I had, and I'm bringing this up for a reason, I had a little profile done on my work that came out in the Chinese Journal of New Media. And first of all, I had no clue what they said, right? I had to download a plugin for the language just to see it. And then there was a firewall there, a language firewall, because it wasn't even about me. I was curious, what else were they talking about in relation to media in Beijing? It would be actually quite fascinating to engage in that discussion, and I felt an amazing frustration that that wasn't even a possibility. There was a joy that, you know, something I do actually went there. But there was also this feeling of this wall of language that was really frustrating to me. And I started thinking, in relation to what you were talking about, if there's a way for some kind of iconography to emerge that's beyond language, that would be some kind of recognition of symbols or sounds, I don't know. But have you thought about it in relation to the ideal community you're talking about, and the emergence of a new system?
Of course, it's a very important point, the one you just stated. We all know that languages are dynamic and are a historical product, but are not fixed ones forever. They do change continuously. Basically, each language comes to life because of a community, and is the tool that the community has realized to communicate and express itself within that group, which used to be geographically localized in a certain area. That's why, for example, we know that from Latin language, many modern European languages evolved. It seems that during the Middle Age, for example, in Italy, there were local dialects which were all variations of Latin. They were corrupted variations of Latin from the point of view of a pure Latin classical language, but nevertheless they were the languages spoken by the people in the cities, in ordinary life. The two main languages, of course, that were competing as a major language in Italy were the dialect in Tuscany and the dialect in Sicily. And this is because both areas had a very powerful literary written tradition. So we see that the ability from a slang, from a street slang to become a proper language deals with the fact of going from the oral to the written medium. And of course, today, the father of Italian language is considered to be Dante Alighieri, who was the first one to take the street slang of Tuscany and write the Divine Comedy in that language. Nobody had done that before, and after he did, that became the language. And and today, if you study Italian language and literature, you start from that book. So, of course, it's an interesting challenge to think about the production of a new language from a non-contiguous community of people. But of course we know that such phenomena like languages do occur across many generations. They do not occur just in the lifespan of a single individual, but it takes different layers. Even if today everything is much faster and there is a very strong acceleration in all these processes. But the language is a good indicator of cultural change. And of course, the ability to pass from the oral state to the written state makes the difference. On the other side, meanwhile, we still need to communicate. So basically, we are using a variety of variations of the English language with every different accent mixed with every different possible term from different languages, and of course the process is very slow. So that's what we have available, and maybe we'll be able to invent. The language is a matter of being understood by the other people. So maybe we'll be able to invent a tool. The language is a tool, is a medium, to make ourselves understood by other people, by other communities. But that's also a matter of sharing enough time. Another evident thing would be to bypass the language limitation with the help of images and sounds. Because the image, our brain, we know 75% of our neurons are dedicated to interpret images or images and sounds together. So there is such important preeminence of the vision in the human brain. And that's why such terrorist attacks as those who destroyed the Twin Towers were immediately understandable by everybody. There's no need to put a caption, or to translate it in 500 languages. Everybody immediately understands what's happening. So the image has actually this power to transcend the national borders. And the music, we could say the same. That's why there's also so much interest in world music happening in the West today.
I'd like to go back to this question of globalization, especially related to what Victoria said, that I'm a little bit worried about the idea of globalization, because it's true that the world is connected by the internet and fiber optics, that we can have access to things that are occurring on the other side of the planet. But still, like, when we talk about globalization, there's always nations who are dominant and other people who are excluded. And actually, I would say that most part of the world population is excluded from this process of globalization. And although we're trying to abolish these economic frontiers as in Europe community, like now you have the same currency for all Europe, and you don't need passport to go through the borders, but still local cultures are stronger than ever, and not only in Europe, in all the world. And politics as well, so sometimes borders are closed. And I'd like to know, like, how do you face this situation, especially in Europe? Because I remember when I was there, I was in France, and I was talking to people, and then I asked, so do you speak German? And people looked at me as I was crazy, because of course nobody spoke German there. They spoke English, but not German. And Germany is like right close to French, so it's like this language, this cultural gap is so big. And how are people dealing with it? And also in other parts of the world, because like local religions and local cultures are still, of course they are very strong. And how, like, this idea of globalization, like, how can we talk about globalization without forgetting this cultural difference and the people who are excluded from this process of networking and don't have access to news and internet and technology?
I agree with what you said. We all know that there is more than half of the world population who is beyond the living standards as far as we conceive them in the West. And of course, we know that the access of resources is very unbalanced, and there is a big imbalance in power in general. We also, there may be some human groups who are taking advantage of the current situation, but I do not believe that there is a specific enemy within humanity that is the one who is responsible for all this. This situation is the result of an historical process. So it's very hard to see or say who is the responsible for the current situation. We have to try to, we have to get to become aware of this, and of course we possibly have to try to do something on our own to change it if we can. I believe that awareness of the human being is something that the West is a little bit turning away from. Maybe in the past it was different, but today everything seems to happen so much on the surface of things that a deep understanding of what the human being is about seems to be obliterated quite often. Also, there are specific issues to try to rebalance this situation, and in geographical studies we talk about development policies for all those parts of the world which find themselves victims of the globalization process. But we have to understand that the machine that we or someone has built is much bigger than any of its parts. And so probably even if you are the President of the United States, your power is bounded and limited by many things, even if, of course, you have much more power than the homeless guy on the street. But it's not that our system is so interconnected that there's not a single individual within the institution who has such a big power. We will see now that maybe this current administration is taking its own path in responding to the terrorist attacks and in dealing with a global geopolitical situation, even if I see that there are some logical problems in the way they are dealing with it. Maybe the individual who is active intellectually or artistically and technologically could contribute to match a better understanding of the human consciousness and of the outside world. Okay, no, but everything is moving, you know. So.
Circulation. Yes.
So, no, I just wanted to maybe say one more thing. I think that, culturally speaking, the variety is a resource. But the challenge we have is that on one side, we need more homogenization because we don't even have a common language. But in order to reach this homogenization, we cannot destroy all the local varieties of each culture. So that's the contradiction we are facing, as far as I can see. And the globalization process is the same thing. On one side, it homogenizes, produces homogeneity, and on the other side, it produces fragmentation, because it fragments other people's time, other people's spaces, other communities' cohesion. And so on one side, it joins people together, and on the other, it breaks people apart. And we are caught in between with this double movement.
But what's interesting is that one or two groups have really made it into the media tackling those kind of issues. One of them is actually the Zapatistas in Chiapas, who have they try to reject that projection you were talking about, that globalized projection or globalized iconography projection, and try to raise a consciousness about that, to re-educate themselves and reaffirm who they are, if not democratize their values, because globalization, its nature is not to cohabitate, you know, it's just to take, engulf, you know, there hasn't been a system to create harmony among communities, because it's all about money. It's all about, you know, just creating economies, you know, based on these entities outside of the area, the geographic area. But in these communities, in these indigenous communities, they've rejected, you know, this projection and try to create their own local networks, you know, local governments, which basically do not respond to the Mexican government as a local government, but as a network of governments where the representative does directly represent that community. You know, it doesn't have a bureaucracy. So I thought that, you know, there are some examples, but they're very, like you said, they're underneath the superficial there. They're not being broadcasted as other dynamics existing that try to cohabitate in this on this planet. But
it's a challenge. I don't think I have an answer to solve this, even to think about this problem. What I see is that it seems we do not have anymore any isolated community on the planet. I think that recently some environmental agency in Brazil discovered a group of Indians who were living in the forest and nobody knew about them, and they didn't know about the rest of the world, and they were, you know, having their own life and their own community and their own culture. But the trend in history has been to reduce more and more this type of isolation, and even if maybe creating other types of isolation related to power imbalance or to economic imbalance, or even to cultural imbalance in terms of accessibility to the resources, to education, etc. It would be nice to think that if each community would be able to give a solution at the local scale, everything would work. But I doubt, because the community are not isolated. There's continuous interpenetration and exchange. And of course, it's very hard to measure how much change each community and each individual is able to take at a given moment in a given place. And that deals a lot with the need for security or the need for opportunities. So you may, I'm not saying that globalization is not creating a lot of problems, but I take for granted that globalization is happening and has been happening for a few centuries. So it's not something that I think can be stopped right away unless a tremendous catastrophe happens, technological catastrophe happens with unknown consequences that bring each community back to a primitive state, so-called. At that point, each community would be isolated again and would need to rebuild their outward links once again, maybe in a better fashion. But currently, we cannot, it's hard to think that the globalization process could be interrupted unless by such a catastrophe. We have to be aware of the downsides of globalization, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that globalization doesn't belong to someone in particular and can be used by anybody who is aware of the way it works in attracting resources on its own territory. So actually, in many cases, there is a competition between different cities, between different regions in the world to attract global investments, which can become an important part in the local development. Of course, it all depends how the development is done then. This is not, I mean, it's not obvious that it's going to be done properly, or it may actually work in developing locally the community. A French medical doctor of the 19th century, Claude Bernard, who inspired Gottman in his understanding of the biological side of geography, stated way before the theory of ecosystems that the human health was the result of the balance between the inner sphere and the outer sphere. And in the inner sphere and the boundary between the two spheres was the body itself. So his idea was that the health for an individual was a balance between the inside of the body and the outside of the environment outside of the body itself. Maybe this concept updated with more recent understanding of the human body, brain, and of the human environment should be possibly of help in driving globalization. But until we leave only the economic forces to rule such processes, then we cannot expect that these processes are solving the problems, the inner problems of the individuals and of the environment. But on the contrary, rather, they are creating maybe more problems for individuals and the environment. That's why I believe that an important role for a contemporary artist is exactly to use the networks in order to propagate a different understanding and a different consciousness of globalization, of the boundaries of the individual and of the community, which would be safer and easier boundaries if they were to happen only locally. It would be easy to manage that. And we know that human communities have been managing local boundaries and local balances for a long time. Like Plato said, keep a small city. If the city grows too big, you know, send the newborn somewhere else and have them make a new city. That's the concept, and at that point the city would become a metropolis, which meant mother of cities. But we know that even in the ancient Greek days, this Platonic concept didn't work, and they actually did rather the opposite. Maybe we should question why there is such an outward push in the history of the West. But that's not an easy question. But I believe that we have to realize that there is not a single responsible for the situation we have. The situation we find ourselves into, as much as we are aware of it, is an historical product. And this historical product cannot be changed like this. But in order to change it from within, maybe the ability to introduce a different degree of consciousness about the individual and about the environment, and also a different level of aesthetics could start to make some difference. Especially if all this is injected within the mediatic networks that envelop our planet and that innerve our cities and our communities. It's, you know, any local experiment like the one you quoted for in Central America is really a challenge, and it is really interesting. But I see that from my point of view, the challenge is to be able to manage with individual and with a group identity that is not bounded by a specific local border. The border is really the border of your outreach, basically.
Well, what's interesting about the communities there now is that they're working with intellectuals in the United States through the internet, and they're able to establish.
So they are using the globalization themselves. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Maintaining the local identities, which are, you know, are ancient dialects for some of the villages. Some of them have been already co-opted by Spanish, so there's a mixture of indigenous dialects and Spanish. Some of them have maintained the original dialects, but they do have that language of communication to the outside world, which is Spanish at this point, and they communicated with intellects, artists. In fact, Roberto Dominguez, he communicates. He's been down to Chiapas a couple of times, and now he networks with them from New York, and he continues that network of information of what's going on down there from here to a more global level, to Europe or the United States. So I mean, it's not really an experiment because it's their survival mechanism to survive down there, but there is a process that's going on that's not very well publicized, but it is going on, and it's not just in Chiapas. There's parts in Asia that's happening, occurring, and parts of Africa that's also happening. They're all networking with each other. Small communities, they're not going to governments or anything. But I mean, it's so critical to have this intellectual thinkers really go meet with the grassroots organizations to really get a grasp of what the needs are to answer those questions which you have about identity and group. But
And also to show others that these are alternate models that are actually working. I think we're limited in knowing what is out there. So it's really important also to even just show. The Chiapas is a great example because artists, I think, played a huge role in bringing it to the world to understand what's going on. That's how I found out about it, through artists' work, not through New York Times or anything.
Well, on the aftermath of September 11, I found myself having problems with news coming from CNN for the first time. And
I wonder why.
yeah, I was, and I still am, deeply concerned about the entire situation. And, but of course, in that days, the confusion was even higher, maybe. And and I realized that a part of a survival strategy would have been just to find access to other sources of information. Of course, the language barrier becomes a major issue because not all countries have appropriate sources in English. But for example, just to speak about the news, I quickly found that there were three different sources, apart from the BBC, which proved to be much better than CNN. And in general, if you have access to a satellite television,